Hello everyone, my name is Asserunla, pre-sales architect here in Frends, and today we're going to look at APIs. We're going to go through some theory first, and then look some statistics, and then a practical demonstration, and of course cover the API strategy everyone should have. So let's recap. What is an API? API stands for Application Programming Interface, and it's used for exchanging pieces of information between different parties, applications of a company or B2B partners, whatnot. And usually nowadays, these HTTP interfaces cover majority of the integration use cases. And to elaborate more, what is an API, we'll use a fun analogy. And like a restaurant, in a restaurant, we have a client, of course, and a waiter, and kitchen. And in this analogy, we can consider the waiter as the API, and of course, kitchen as a backend system. And of course, client would be the API consumer, so to say. And of course, in a restaurant with waiters, the client orders their meal, like in this scenario, the customer states, yeah, I like a burger, please. The waiter takes in that order and delivers that information to the kitchen. And the kitchen, of course, then makes that order ready for the waiter to then deliver it to the customer's or client's table. And the waiter handles all the customer service, and the client needs to only interact with the waiter, and they don't need to think about what's happening in the kitchen and so on. And this is now a great analogy for APIs. So, of course, with APIs, we have the clients, the API consumers, and the clients post API calls to the actual API, and then the API handles all the communication with the backend service. It can handle the authentication, authorization, throttling, and so on. And of course, when we get the piece of information from the backend service, the API returns that to the actual client, the initial API caller. So that's very baseline of what is an API. But of course, looking back at the analogy, then we might have multiple different clients. We might have multiple different waiters. And of course, the kitchen might also have an outdoor grill. We might have a drinks bar, dessert bar, and so on. And of course, when we have tens of different clients, they might order various things from the menu, like a burger and a Coke, please, maybe without pickles. And then it's the waiter's job to deliver that piece of information to the correct places, to the outdoor grill or kitchen, and so on. And also, regarding the customer service, the waiter should also handle the ill-behaving customers. Like if someone is trying to order sushi in a burger restaurant, then the waiter, of course, needs to tell them, yeah, that's not possible, try something else. And of course, if the client starts disturbing other clients, like throwing tables and being loud, then of course the waiter can remove the client from the restaurant altogether and maybe even blacklist them. And of course, the same practice applies to APIs, but in the APIs, we usually have hundreds or thousands or even millions consumers, and of course, number of APIs and the backend services can be very complicated as well. And of course, then the value of API or proper API management comes when we can aggregate all the needed information from the backend services to the corresponding clients. So that's a bit of background to the APIs, and now we should understand what they are. And of course, the APIs have a major role in modern IT, so we'll go through them. First of all, of course, the APIs provide the connectivity to the various systems, applications a company or business might have, very disparate systems in the IT landscape. And of course, APIs is one way of publishing that information and enable the connectivity. And of course, sometimes companies might use an integration platform to consume those APIs like we do with Frends. Of course, the APIs bring in the table tremendous amount of efficiency and reusability. And when we're building reusable APIs, we can reuse certain components when we have new needs. And then that, of course, makes the entire IT development more efficient and scalable. And of course, we like to offer like B2B partners the possibility to order via API instead of calling the salesman. So that also cuts cost and makes the business more efficient. Also, when the API needs scale, you might have more API consumers, more business needs, then of course the APIs provide scalability. And of course, we need to scale the resources accordingly and make sure that the APIs scale all the way. Then of course, very crucial part of APIs is the security and control. So we can control who is using those APIs if they're not made public. We can handle the authentication and authorization. That's very crucial. And then, of course, we might set up throttling and set quotas for API consumers that they can only consume it just. And of course, regarding the control, we should monitor the APIs so that we can fuel the improvement by learning how we use how the customers use the APIs or different applications use those APIs. So we get the feedback loop of understanding how the APIs are used and how to improve them. And of course, the innovation and flexibility is a crucial part nowadays, as APIs allow innovating new business and of course new integrations, new ways of businesses talking to each other. So keep that in mind when you are thinking about the APIs. And of course, the flexibility comes from when we are building APIs in front of different disparate systems, we are building a facade. So as we saw on the restaurant analogy, clients are only interested in interacting with the waiter, or the clients are only interested in interacting with the API. So they don't need to be concerned what's happening behind. So then we can swap different systems behind those API facades and keep the business running. Then, of course, always like to show some statistics, how the APIs are seen and understood at the moment. So for instance, 52% of enterprise leaders agree that APIs accelerate innovation by exposing assets with partners provided by Google. And on the security part, fintech companies report API security as the leading concern in API usage. So we need to make sure that the APIs are secure. We handle the authentication and authorization and all of that side of the APIs. And the 50% of the leading cloud-based software companies' revenue is by APIs, given by Harvard Business Review. And 39% of enterprises desire easier integration between the tools they use for company management. And 56% of enterprise leaders agree that APIs help them build better digital experiences and products. So we can see the trend here, but not stopping there. A bit older statistic from 2020. In then healthcare industry experienced the increase of 400% of API traffic. That's massive. And then we can just vision what would be the same number nowadays. And also quite interesting, the 15% of APIs are publicly available. So fairly small number, a sixth of all the APIs. And also from the banking industry, 5% of banking APIs are used externally to generate revenue by McKinsey Digital. And in 2020, 30% of developers report that developers in 2020 report that they spend around 30% of their time coding APIs. And as we know that the business matures and technologies mature, then I can only guess that this number today will be even higher. And of course, lastly, 77% of companies with successful API management transformations translate their strategy into operational mechanisms, monitoring progress, and making changes by Deloitte Research. And all of these numbers paint a picture that there is massive potential, there is growth, but still we are not fully leveraging the APIs nowadays. And then, of course, when we want to tackle the problem, we need to have best practices for scalable and secure API design. So, not a simple topic, of course, but there are a few things we can take into account. Of course, it all begins with understanding the requirements and business needs, and we need to understand for what are we building those APIs, what is the actual benefit of those APIs, and of course, what requirements, functional or non-functional requirements, are for those APIs. Then, of course, we need to select the proper platform which enables the scaling. And for instance, with Frends, we can set up the API so that they can basically scale indefinitely. So keep that in mind. And also, we need to consider the performance of the APIs. We can cache the information we are providing to the API consumers. And of course, we need to make sure that the APIs are easy to use. And of course, don't take that much time. So nobody wants to use APIs if they respond the information back in 5 seconds, even if it's fairly simple. So keep that in mind. We want to see performant APIs. And so then, of course, again, the security, that's a big part of the APIs nowadays. And of course, crucial parts of security are the authentication and authorization. We can handle those with API keys, OAuth 2 flows, and certificates. And of course, like I said, the throttling. And last but not least is always to use encrypted connections like with HTTPS. Then fifth is the governance. So of course, we need to understand the versioning of the APIs. We need to monitor them. We need to understand how they are doing. Should we improve them? And of course, get the feedback loop also from the API consumers, whether they are internal or external. Good. Then, how do we integrate APIs with existing IT infrastructure? And I bet everyone's wet daydream would be to go greenfield every time when they are building IT projects, but that's not the case. So it's good to consider how we can take or leverage APIs in an existing infrastructure. Let's have an example. So we have one imaginary company with this following architecture. So on the top, we have 3 cloud systems: CRM, product information management system, HR, and then also this company has B2B partners that want to integrate with this company and their business. And then on the bottom, we have on-premises environment with ERP, MES, and workforce management system. And we could now have point-to-point integrations here, which would look something like this. So it's a spaghetti integration landscape, and it would be a mess even for the B2B partners to consume this business's services. For instance, putting out orders when there's no APIs, that's very hard and of course very costly. But then, how could we fit Frends into this equation? So let's have a look at the systems without any integrations, and this would be now one option for Frends to solve the connectivity and of course publishing APIs for different systems in their corresponding environments, like on cloud, on premises, and for instance now for the B2B partners, the consumption of those APIs will be much easier. And of course, with this kind of setup, we can prove that all those 5 points I displayed earlier, they are now covered. We can get the connectivity to all of the different systems and the partners. We get efficiency and reusability when we're using APIs with Frends. We get the scalability as long as we choose proper Frends agents there, like with Kubernetes cluster and high availability setup. And then of course, security and control. We need to configure those to the Frends APIs, but out of the box features working just fine. And then of course, this now cultivates the innovation and flexibility. So you can, for instance, imagine if this company would be changing the ERP, we wouldn't have to think about all the connections to the different system. systems like with the previous spaghetti architecture. We just now need to make sure that the APIs are working still, and then the game continues. And then, of course, the hardest part, of course, we can derive various different architectures, but the rolling out of the APIs is the crucial part. So first, we identify what are the use cases for these APIs, what are the actual applications we need to integrate with, and of course, what are the actual API consumers? Are they internal, external applications, or other businesses? So that's the first thing. And then we define. The approach, and in some scenarios it might be a fully fledged API strategy, but in some scenarios it's just integration solution architecture. But in any case, we need to define what we are doing. Then, of course, we deploy the platform. So selecting the platform that can scale, that are easy to use. Of course, they need to be cost efficient. And then when we have deployed the platform into the actual architecture, let's implement the APIs. And of course, when the APIs are up and running, they've been published, we need to market those capabilities. So it doesn't do us any good if we have APIs, but nobody knows how to use them or when to use them. So let's market them. We can set up the API portal. We can even set up roadshows, and we just need to be loud. So make sure your internal stakeholders and external stakeholders know that you have APIs available. Then, of course, we need to listen and improve on that. So we need to monitor the APIs, understand how they are being used, and of course, get the data analysis in place. And of course, we need to manage the developer outreach. We need to ask from the developers how are they seeing those APIs, what could be improved, and then act on it. Excellent. Then, always good to have a theoretical background, but also now let's see a practical example how we develop APIs with Frends. And of course, taking into account the scalability, security. So let's go. First, like always, we will start in Frends. So I have now here Frends open. So in the APIs view, we can start managing those APIs, creating them, and let's open the APIs here. And as we know, with Frends, all the implementation of integrations and APIs is happening in the browser. So all I need to make sure is that I have the proper access to this said Frends environment. So we can look at existing APIs here, but we're going to start from scratch. So you're going to see just how easy it is to develop APIs with Frends. So as we are in the development environment within Frends, we can just click Create New. So now we are giving this sample API boilerplate, and on the left-hand side, we have the OpenAPI specification 3, the standardized API modeling language. And with this, we are going to now define what sort of endpoints does this API have, what sort of parameters does this API take, and of course, the security and so on. But for this demo, I'm not going to be writing it from scratch. Instead, I'm going to be using an existing OpenAPI specification 3, which I'm going to paste here like so. So now we can see the entire API with all of its endpoints, and now it's rendered as a Swagger view here on the right-hand side. We have the name of the API, Amazing Company API. We have some descriptions, and now we have two endpoints. We are retrieving a list of sales orders and also retrieving list of products this amazing company has. So this would work great in a situation where, for instance, a partner of this amazing company would like to see the sales orders and of course see the products that they want to order. And of course, on the left-hand side, we have the YAML of that OpenAPI specification. We can see that, for instance, in the sales order, we have a get function with responses of 200 and 500, like for successful execution and if something failed. And also we have the product endpoint with only the 200 response. And of course, we have configured the security here. So we are using basically authentication for this API from the get-go. And in the components, we have all the data modeled here like so. Good. So now we have the API specification ready. Then we can save it. So we have the actual frame of that API here in Frends. So now we have specified it. And as said, we have two endpoints. So first is the sales order. The second one is the product. And now, as this is just an API and its specification. So we used the specification first tactic here. So we modeled the API, but now we need to actually implement the API functionality. So we have two endpoints and we can create Frends processes behind them. And of course, we can use pass-through APIs as well. But for this demo, we're going to implement sales order as a traditional Frends process with an API trigger, and the product endpoint we will configure as a pass-through API. And now we can start with the sales order. So let's click just create new process. And now Frends makes this even easier as the API specification is now derived from that API management view to this actual process. So here we can see the basic process editor of Frends. We have already API trigger here derived from that OpenAPI specification. And also we have the two returns here already set as we defined in the OpenAPI specification 3.0. And for this demo, let's remove the 500 return and just focus on the happy day scenario where we get the API call and then we return the sales orders. And even in this return, which is HTTP response, of course, as we're talking about APIs, we get an example of that actual return value here, which is basically the HTTP response for the API consumer. So we can keep that in mind. And now we just need to model out what is happening between these elements in the Frends process, between the trigger and the return. And for this use case, we are going to get the sales orders from a database. And that is going to be like, of course, database call. And we can use Microsoft execute query task for it. So let's select that. And traditional Frends development, we just configure these various tasks with their properties. And of course, we can start by connection string. I already have a database in mind where we can get the sales orders. So let's make a environment variable reference for the connection string. It's going to be a secret. And I know it's going to be called like AdventureWorks connection string. And now Frends is already suggesting it. So let's pick that one. And then now what we need to do is to configure the SQL statement for Frends to retrieve all those sales orders. And we're going to use, in this scenario, a SQL query, which is going to look like this. So we're selecting only the top 100 sales orders, all the fields from saleslt.salesorder_demo table. And now we can, of course, try this query out with Frends by clicking advanced settings and create a new test. And very cool feature of Frends as we can unit test these functionalities while we develop it. So of course, now we need to select on which agent are we running this task. Let's hit run on the development agent. So now this actual task test is going to be executed on the agent, and then the actual result is returned back to the developer here in the Frends control panel. And yeah, the query was successful with certain start time, took 380 milliseconds. And in the result, we can see what data are we getting from that database. So we are getting sales order information from there. And as it happens to be, we are getting the same actual data structure as we did specify on the API specification. So now we can be happy with that. And of course, we are interested returning this data's value, the property data. So now we can just give the task name, get sales orders. And now as that task works, as we assume, we're going to just connect that to the actual return. And now we need to make a reference in this return to that previous task's result. And with Frends, as we know, it happens with notation #result something, and in brackets we get the sales orders and dot data. And basically now we are returning the result from that SQL query to the actual API caller, like so. And of course, this is a fairly simple use case and example, but we could implement pagination here. We can handle the exceptions if, for instance, the database doesn't respond. We can raise alerts to our operations team and so on. We can manipulate the data as we'd like. But for the sake of this demo, let's keep it like so. And now we can try to validate it by clicking the validate button on the bottom of the screen. Let's hit validate. And now, process compiled successfully. Yes, good. So now we can save it. And of course, we can create and activate it. So it will be deployed to the development agent and activated there. So let's do so. There we have now the one process we just built. Now, again, visible on the API management view of Frends. So that's the traditional way of building APIs with Frends. But now one of the latest features is the pass-through APIs. So in a scenario where we have an existing API exposed by some application, but we want to place Frends in between to get the monitoring, to get the authentication in place. So we can just create pass-through APIs, and as their name suggests, they are just passing that API call to the backend system and then returning that to the actual Frends API caller. So let's configure that next. And let's hit create pass-through API. And here we can configure to all of those endpoints the pass-throughs, but now we are interested in the product endpoint. And let's click create pass-through, and now we can configure what is the target URL, meaning the target endpoint in the backend system. So we can, for instance, get environment variable references here. We can reference the API calls base path and operation path, but for this demo, we are just gonna hard code it. So let's pick up the actual endpoint for it. So that let's paste that product endpoint and let's remove those other references. So now we have that actual endpoint selected as the target for this pass-through API. And I can also sneak peek what that API returns. So it's going to be returning product information. And now we can just basically publish this with Frends. So let's hit save changes. And now we should have the pass-through API configured as well. So now returning back to the API management view with our amazing company API, we have configured the sales order and the product endpoints. And with the sales order, we have the Frends process behind it. But with the product endpoint, we have a pass-through API. So good. Now we have the endpoints functionality ready. Then we need to consider what is the authentication method. Would this be a public API or whatnot? So let's do that next. So in Frends, we have API policies, which are allowing us to configure various authentication mechanisms and logging features. But before that, we need to select what is the authentication method. So are we using API keys? Are we using OAuth 2 flows with a separate identity provider? Or are we using Frends' private applications, which is basically a API keys on steroids? So with private applications, we are basically generating JWTs within Frends, and we can control them here very easily. And as they are JWTs, like JSON Web Tokens, we can add different claims to them and we get better control over these JWTs. And of course, we can set the validity time, like it can be valid for 2 years or 1 year or whatnot. And of course, we can also revoke these tokens if needed. But let's create entirely new private application, and we're going to name it Amazing Co private application, like so. And now we can see also that sub claim here on the token is now Amazing Co private application. So let's keep that in mind, because in the Frends API policies, we're going to link the actual policy to this subject claim. So I'm going to make a copy of that on my laptop, like so. And now we can just save the private application, and now we can create token with these claims. So let's hit create token, give it a name, Amazing Co token. We give the validity time of 2 years, and let's generate that. And as now we can see, now Frends control panel has generated us with the JWT with the payload we can see right here. Good. And of course, we can view all the generated tokens for this. We can, for instance, revoke them, we can regenerate them, and of course, view the tokens themselves. Good. So now, as we have the private application implemented here or configured, then we can move on to the API policies. So within Frends, we can control the access to those APIs with these API policies, and we can create very intricate rules and of course link those to the private application JWTs. So let's hit create new. We'll create a new API policy for our Amazing Company API. So Amazing Co API policy, like so. And of course, we could give it a description. The best description, of course, helping out the developers or users of Frends to understand why is this API policy here. Then, of course, we can give some tags. We can then go to configuring what are the endpoints this API policy is targeting. And we have one boilerplate here ready, or one example ready. But now we would be interested in the Amazing Co v1, which we just previously configured. So let's select that. And of course, we can create these rules or targets per endpoint as well. So let's set the entire API here. And of course, we can configure the HTTP methods as well. But let's select the get method. And now let's save it meanwhile. And now we have the API policy in place, but still we need to configure the identities. And let's do that. So we could, for instance, give this policy a public access, but we shouldn't do that. But instead, we're going to select the private applications, or if we would choose like the API keys or OAuth 2 flows. But in this scenario, we'll use the private application. So Amazing Co identity, like so. And now we select what agent groups is this targeting. So let's go with the development so far. So then we can click add identity. And now we need to actually configure even further. So we can then add rules. We can set the throttling, like we discussed that throttling is one key feature of secure APIs. And of course, let's then configure the first rule. And as we know that JWTs have these different claims, like we have the claim sub with a value in our private application token, the Amazing Co private application. So we are now checking, is it an exact match, or does it just exist, or we can even give rechecks to configure those different claims. And now, as you can understand, this gives very granular control over the application consumers of these APIs. Good. And let's save it here in between. And then for the configuration of logging, let's click new login configuration so that we can then, with the Frends API monitoring, log all the API calls and see how these APIs are actually being used. So let's add amazing call logging. And of course, we'll select which agent group is this targeting. We can go with the development so far and click add configuration. And of course, we can define what fields of those API calls are we logging. But let's go with the identity and query parameters for now. But for instance, we could log even the entire bodies of those API calls. So let's leave it there. Let's hit save changes. And now we have everything we need in place for consuming our new API. And before we go into there, I'm just gonna need to copy that actual token. So we'll check the Amazing Co private application. We're gonna view the generated tokens so that we can actually use it. So let's click view token, and the token is here. Let's hit copy, and now we have on our clipboard the actual token. So now we can try consuming those APIs, or that API we just built, which is the Amazing Company API. And with Frends, we can get a link directly to the agent where this API is being deployed to. So by hitting the API specification UI, now we can see the Swagger view of this API. And bear in mind that this is now hosted in the agent and not in the control panel. And of course, now we can see, yeah, Amazing Company API with the two endpoints we just configured. And also, as we configured the authorization for this API on the Swagger view, we need to configure the authorization here. So let's give it the bearer and pasting that actual JWT here and click authorize. So now in the browser, we can actually try these endpoints out. And first of all, let's begin with the sales order. So here we can see example according to our API specification, but when we click try it out, we can actually now make a one API call to that actual endpoint. And we should see a multiple rows of these kind of sales orders. So let's see. I'm hitting execute and yeah, good. Worked just fine. So we're getting a whole lot of rows for the sales orders. And now we know, yeah, the API looks to be working as designed. Excellent. So that was the API endpoint with the Frends process behind it. But now let's check the actual pass-through API, which was the product endpoint. So let's click that open, and here we can see the example value of a response. But when we try it out, we should see a lot more rows in this scenario as well. So let's hit execute, and there we go. So lots of data there coming from the actual Frends API endpoints. Good. I'm happy. And now actually we don't need to rely only on testing these APIs, because within Frends we have an excellent API monitoring feature, which we can open up from the APIs view here. So on the right hand side, we have a button view monitoring. So let's click that. And actually there we can see. So we are filtering this API at the moment. And as we did two API calls from the Swagger UI on this separate tab here, and also on the API monitoring, we can see two executions or two API calls. So first was the actual sales order endpoint being called. And of course, we can see some details out of it. And also with the target, we can see if it did trigger any Frends processes like we have here. So we get the power of the traditional Frends logging features as well. So we can see all the Frends processes being executed. Awesome. And of course, we can click through all these elements and get the data we need. Although there might be some big chunks of data, so taking a bit of time on my laptop to load. But there we go, working very nicely. And with the pass-through API, with the product endpoint, we can see the target, which we did configure in the pass-through API settings. Good, that's about it. So of course, when we do more API calls, we can give them a few for the product endpoint and then refresh the API monitoring, we can see, yeah, we did get more API calls correspondingly. Excellent. So now, brief demo. Let's jump back and see what should be the next steps for your API strategy. So, of course, it's not a simple task, but here are some key takeaways you need to consider. Okay, first, identify the need. So, what are your business needs for the API strategy? And of course, need to recognize the landscape and use cases. So, where are the applications? Who are the API consumers? What are the actual API use cases? And then, when you have identified the need and the landscape and the use cases, then define the API strategy. And of course, the API strategy is a manifold case. So of course, you can start by defining the goals. So do you want to increase revenue? Do you want to increase business? Do you want to streamline and cut cost? And do you want to monetize the API consumption? These need to be written down when defining the API strategy. And of course, you need to consider what is the API audience or what is the consumers? Who are they? Are they companies? Are they your partners? Are they consumers? Those need to be established. And then, of course, you need to figure out what is the API structure and are you building, for instance, REST APIs? What kind of APIs you're actually building? So what kind of APIs to implement? And then, of course, you can consider the data standardization. How do you present the data coming out of your system and so on? Then, of course, key to the strategy is the security and compliance. So you need to consider the authentication, authorization. Would the APIs be fully open for everyone? Would you need to be limiting the rates? And do you need to set up quotas for API consumers? And of course, what are you logging out of your APIs? And then when you got those in place, you need to think about the architecture you're playing in. So where would those APIs be hosted? Can they be on the cloud, on premises, in both? What are the performance requirements? What is the hosting platform? Do you need to scale them rapidly from time to time? And of course, what are the actual backend applications you have in your IT infrastructure? And then, of course, the monetization model is a crucial part of the API strategy. Are you getting money when people are using, or customers or clients or partners are using the APIs? So it can be free, it can be like freemium, it can be like tiered, so, or even pay-as-you-go models. So need to recognize what is the monetization potential in here. And of course, then when you have that in place, you need to think about how you go into the market. So go-to-market plan, GTM plan. So need to consider marketing, you need to consider roadshows, again, need to be loud, and of course, manage the developer outreach. How do you get the different developers using your APIs, and how do you get the best value out of it? And of course, you can consider different marketplaces, different ecosystems. How is these APIs documented? You might have an API portal. How would you do that? How would you share those Swagger views like we just did? So think about the go-to-market plan. And then, of course, the governance. So you need to align your organization to be able to implement these APIs and who will be managing them, operating them, and throughout their life cycle, meaning the API's life cycle. So you need to have still the people in place to decide what to do and when. And then, of course, changes occur, different backend application might change. Then, of course, if that boils down also to the APIs, or you need to change the APIs accordingly, then you need to handle the change management. And of course, with the governance of the APIs, you need to handle the versioning and end-of-life management, like when would you phase out different versions of those APIs? And of course, you need to communicate those to the API consumers as well. And of course, when you're logging and monitoring the APIs, you're going to need to put a feedback loop in place. So you're going to get information. How are your APIs doing? How are they being used? What should be improved on? And of course, when defining the API strategy, we are here to help you. So don't hesitate to ask from us. And we want to guide you through the wilderness of API strategies. And then, of course, when you have the API strategy in place, get the platform in place. So, of course, according to the strategy, the architecture, the different needs, then put the platform in place and start executing the actual strategy. That's about it. So the biggest part is actually the definition of the API strategy. We are happy to help you out and get your APIs up and running. That's it from my part. Thank you very much.